It began with the rain, not a cleansing spring drizzle, but a relentless curtain of water that turned roads into rivers and fields into swamps. The first year, people muttered about bad luck. The second year, they whispered about God's anger. By the third, when the crops lay rotting in the mud and the granaries stood empty, no one bothered with words. Only the sound of hollow stomachs and the quiet scrape of a spoon against an empty bowl. The Great Famine did not announce itself, with armies at the gate or a sudden plague. It crept in slowly, tightening its grip until every waking thought was about food. Villages emptied, markets turned into riots, and families bartered the last of their possessions or their freedom for a crust of bread. This was hunger on a scale few could imagine, and none would ever forget. Long before the great catastrophes that would come to define this century, the world was already a fragile and restless place. The foundations of society, though they appeared solid to those living within them, were riddled with cracks. Kingdoms rose and fell not with the slow dignity of age, but with the sudden violence of storms. Borders shifted as often as the seasons, each change bringing new laws, new masters, and fresh demands upon a weary population. Political instability was not a passing misfortune, it was a way of life. Alliances between rulers, nobles, and foreign powers could be built on one day and shattered the next. A marriage between royal houses might promise peace, but a single insult or ambition could undo it overnight. Ordinary people were caught in the tide, their fates tied to decisions made in distant halls they would never see. For the poor farmer or the struggling merchant, politics was not a matter of debate or principle. It was an unpredictable force, like the weather, that could sweep away livelihoods without warning. Wars erupted not only between kingdoms, but within them. Succession disputes, noble rivalries, and local rebellions kept the land in constant unrest. Armies roamed the countryside, their presence as destructive as any foreign invasion. Soldiers needed to eat, and they would take what they required: food, livestock, shelter, without hesitation. Villages found themselves stripped bare, their men conscripted, their women and children left to fend for themselves. Even in times when no battles raged nearby, the scars of previous conflicts lingered: burned fields, abandoned farms, and ruined towns dotted the landscape. Trade routes, once reliable, were often disrupted by raiding bands or toll-collecting lords eager to profit from instability. Hunger and want traveled faster than armies, leaving little hope for recovery before the next disaster struck. Famine was a familiar visitor, returning in cycles that people could not break. The reasons were many: failed harvests due to poor weather, shortages caused by war, or simply the inability of the land to produce enough for its growing population. Agricultural techniques were rudimentary, and the success of a harvest depended on conditions beyond human control. A late frost, a swarm of locusts, or a season of too much rain could doom entire regions to scarcity. When food grew scarce, prices rose sharply. Grain merchants and landowners often took advantage of the crisis, selling only to those who could pay the highest price. For the poor, this meant eating less, skipping meals, or relying on thin gruel to survive. Malnutrition set in quickly, making bodies more vulnerable to disease. Parents went hungry to feed their children, while some children were sent away to beg in nearby towns, their small hands outstretched in silent desperation. The cities, far from being safe havens, had their own perils. Poor sanitation was an invisible threat that claimed countless lives. Streets were narrow, muddy, and often filled with refuse. Waste from households and workshops found its way into open drains, which overflowed into the places where people walked, worked, and sold their goods. In such conditions, clean water was a rarity, and even when found, it could not be trusted. Wells could be easily contaminated, and rivers served as both sources of drinking water and dumping grounds for filth. Disease thrived in these environments. Coughs, fevers, and rashes spread quickly from one person to another, especially in crowded markets and tenements. Few understood the true causes of illness, and remedies were as likely to harm as to heal. Primitive medicine relied heavily on tradition, superstition, and the limited knowledge of local healers. Treatments might involve bleeding a patient to balance the humors, applying herbs of uncertain potency, or invoking charms against evil spirits. Injuries that would be trivial today could be deadly then. A cut from a farm tool, a burn from the hearth, or a broken bone from a fall could lead to infection and death. Surgery existed, but it was crude and performed without anesthesia. Those who survived often did so through sheer luck and the strength of their constitution, not because of the skill of their caretakers. Danger was ever present, not only from sickness and hunger, but from the natural world itself. Storms could flatten crops and sink fishing boats. Floods could sweep away homes and drown entire herds. Winters could be harsh, with frost creeping into every unheated room and snow blocking the roads that might bring vital supplies. Even in the best of times, the margin between survival and disaster was painfully thin, and yet perhaps the most relentless force pressing upon the people of this age was fear. It was not just the fear of starvation, illness, or violence, though those were constant companions. It was also the fear of the unknown, of forces they could not see or understand. Nature itself was often perceived as unpredictable and hostile. A failed harvest could be blamed on displeased spirits or divine punishment. Strange lights in the sky might be taken as omens, foretelling war or the death of a king. Sudden storms or earthquakes were signs that the world was unsettled and that human affairs were at the mercy of powers beyond comprehension. Rulers, too, were objects of fear. Kings and lords held near absolute authority over their lands, and their word could determine the fate of an individual or an entire village. To defy them, even in small ways, was to court ruin. Taxes and levies were demanded without regard for the hardship they caused, and punishments for disobedience could be severe. The church, deeply woven into the fabric of life, offered both comfort and control. Faith was a central part of existence, but it was also a source of anxiety. The threat of eternal damnation hung heavily over daily life, and misfortune could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. Superstition flourished, with people clinging to charms, rituals, and relics to ward off ill fate. In such a world, survival required more than just physical endurance. It demanded adaptability, resilience, and a willingness to accept hardship as inevitable. For many, life was less about living fully than about enduring. Joy was found in small victories, a successful harvest, the safe return of a loved one, the birth of a healthy child. But these moments were tempered by the knowledge that they could be swept away in an instant. This was the reality into which the century's greatest miseries would descend. A population already weakened by hunger, worn down by war, and living in unsanitary conditions stood at the edge of a precipice. They did not know it yet, but the worst was still to come. What awaited them would not be a single disaster, but a cascade of calamities that would redefine what it meant to suffer. It is easy to look back from the present and see the events of history as distant, their pain dulled by time. But for those who lived then, each day was a fragile balancing act between hope and despair. The smallest change in weather, politics, or fortune could tip the scales toward ruin. And so they rose each morning with the weight of uncertainty pressing upon them, knowing only that survival itself was an achievement. The world was already on the edge, and the slightest push, a plague, a war, a famine, could send it tumbling into an abyss from which it would take generations to climb. The century's miseries deepened into something unimaginable when a sickness unlike any other began to spread across the known world. At first, it was a rumor, whispered by travelers, merchants, and sailors who had seen its effects in far-off lands. A strange and terrible disease, they said, one that killed swiftly and without mercy. Few believed it could reach their own towns and villages. Diseases were common enough, but none had ever burned through humanity the way this one would. Its beginnings lay far to the east, in lands that most Europeans knew only from trade stories and pilgrim tales. Historians would later trace it to the steppes of Central Asia, where a microscopic killer lurked within the blood of fleas, hidden on the backs of black rats. These rats, stowaways in the wagons and ships of merchants, traveled along the great trade routes that connected continents. In time, the disease followed them, riding the Silk Road westward toward Europe. It is said that the plague found one of its early footholds in the bustling trade city of Kaffa, on the shores of the Black Sea. There, during a siege in the mid-14th century, an army afflicted by the disease hurled the bodies of their dead over the city walls. Whether this act truly marked the moment of the plague's arrival or is simply a grim legend, the result was the same: The sickness entered the city and began its slow, relentless journey across Europe. Ships leaving Kaffa carried the plague to the great ports of the Mediterranean. From there, it moved with terrifying speed. In an age when travel was measured in weeks, even months, it seemed impossible for anything to spread so far so fast. Yet by land and sea, it advanced, leaving death in its wake. Town after town fell silent. The disease respected no borders, no walls, and no defenses. When the plague reached a community, it did not take long for its effects to become visible. At first, people might suffer from a sudden fever, chills, and overwhelming weakness. Then came the swelling, painful lumps, called buboes, usually found in the armpits, groin, or neck. These swellings were often black or deep purple, as though the body itself was rotting from within. In many cases, victims vomited blood, their skin mottled with dark spots. Death often followed within days, sometimes even within hours. No one understood the true cause. The connection between fleas, rats, and the sickness was centuries away from being discovered. Instead, explanations ranged from the wrath of God to poisoned air, from the influence of distant planets to the malevolent acts of enemies. In the absence of answers, fear took on a life of its own, and the death toll was staggering. In some places, entire households were wiped out in less than a week. Churches struggled to bury the dead as graveyards filled to overflowing. The air in many towns carried the smell of decay, and the tolling of church bells became a constant reminder of mortality. The numbers are hard to comprehend even now. Some regions lost a third, even half, of their people. In villages, it was not uncommon for fields to go untended, livestock to wander unattended, and homes to collapse into ruin because there was simply no one left to care for them. The social fabric began to tear. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor. Families abandoned their sick, hoping to avoid infection themselves. In some places, entire streets were boarded up, trapping the sick inside with the healthy in desperate attempts to contain the spread. Suspicion fell on outsiders, travelers, foreigners, and those who lived apart from the main community. Rumors of deliberate poisoning and malicious sorcery spread, leading to violence against those who were seen as different. The wealthy, believing their status might shield them, fled to the countryside, retreating to isolated estates. Yet the plague was no respecter of rank. Kings and nobles fell alongside peasants and beggars. Monks and priests, who stayed behind to comfort the dying, perished in great numbers, leaving monasteries and churches empty. Commerce came to a halt. Markets that had once been crowded with goods and chatter now stood deserted. Ships lay idle in harbors, their crews dead or too afraid to sail. Trade routes fell silent, not from lack of goods, but from fear of what they might carry. Farmers, unable to plant or harvest, left fields bare, deepening the famine that already gripped many regions. In some towns, carts piled high with corpses rolled through the streets, collecting the dead for mass graves. There was no time for proper burials, no space for individual tombs. The dead were laid side by side, covered with thin layers of earth, and then joined by more as the days went on. The rituals of death that once provided comfort were abandoned out of necessity. The psychological toll was immense. For those who survived the first wave, life was a daily exercise in waiting. Waiting for the knock on the door that would bring bad news, for the first sign of fever, for the next funeral. Every cough, every ache could be a death sentence. People withdrew into themselves, not only to avoid contact, but because hope itself seemed dangerous. To hope was to invite disappointment. And yet, even in the midst of despair, there were those who sought meaning in the devastation. Some turned to faith with renewed fervor, believing the plague to be divine punishment and seeking forgiveness through prayer and penitence. Groups of flagellants traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in an attempt to atone for the sins of the world. Others turned to hedonism, reasoning that if death was inevitable, one might as well indulge in every pleasure before it came. The plague did not pass quickly. It came in waves, retreating only to return again, sometimes years later, to finish what it had begun. Those who had survived one outbreak might be struck down in the next. Entire generations grew up in its shadow, their lives shaped by loss, scarcity, and the constant reminder that death was never far away. In time, the Black Death would leave more than graves behind. It would reshape economies, weaken the power of feudal lords, and alter the course of history itself. But in the moment, there was only the immediate terror of survival. The world had been teetering on the edge, and the arrival of the plague pushed it into a freefall from which it would take centuries to recover. The centuries' suffering had reached a new depth. Hunger and war had already tested the endurance of humanity. But the Black Death brought something different. A force that could not be bargained with, fought against, or escaped by any means known at the time. It was invisible, merciless, and everywhere. And for those living through it, the only certainty was that nothing would ever be the same again. If disease was a silent killer, war was a roaring, unrelenting one. In this century, peace was not a condition to be cherished. It was a rare pause between battles. Conflict was the constant background to life, shaping economies, politics, and the daily struggles of common people. The world did not just endure war, it was built around it. The most infamous of these drawn-out struggles was the 100 Years' War, a series of brutal campaigns between England and France that stretched across generations. The name suggests a single, continuous conflict, but in truth, it was a patchwork of battles, truces, and renewed hostilities. For the people living in its shadow, however, it felt endless. Entire lifetimes could pass without ever knowing what it was like to live in genuine peace. The causes of such wars were rarely simple. Dynastic disputes, claims to land, trade rivalries, and wounded pride all played their part. Kings and nobles sought glory and legitimacy on the battlefield, often using minor insults or contested inheritances as pretexts for vast military campaigns. The reasons may have been political, but the suffering was borne almost entirely by ordinary people. When armies marched, they needed food, shelter, and supplies, and they seldom paid for them. Soldiers, whether they were professional fighters, conscripts, or mercenaries, were a burden as much as they were a defense. They took what they required, leaving villages stripped bare. Grain stores were emptied, livestock slaughtered, and homes commandeered as quarters. Fields, once green with crops, were trampled underfoot or burned deliberately to deny the enemy resources. For the people whose lands lay between rival powers, there was no safety. Civilians were trapped between armies, never sure who would arrive next or what they would demand. To one side, they might be loyal subjects. To the other, they were enemies deserving punishment. Allegiances could be forced at sword point, and a promise to one army could be seen as treachery by the next to pass through. The destruction of farmland had consequences far beyond the immediate loss of food. Planting seasons were missed, harvests failed, and famine followed. Even when the war front shifted elsewhere, the scars remained. Blackened ruins where homes once stood, abandoned mills, and orchards cut down for firewood. The work of years could be undone in a single campaign season. Beyond the battlefield, war disrupted every corner of society. Trade routes became dangerous as merchants risked robbery or ransom. Taxes rose steeply as rulers sought to fund their armies, and these demands came on top of the theft and destruction caused by the soldiers themselves. The burden was heaviest on the poor, who had nothing left to give but were forced to surrender it anyway. Mercenaries in particular were feared. Often foreigners with no ties to the land, they were loyal only to their pay, and when the pay stopped, they turned to plunder. Entire bands of these soldiers roamed the countryside, extorting money from towns in exchange for sparing them from destruction. Their presence meant that even in periods without official battles, violence remained a daily threat. The war was not only fought on open fields. Sieges were a favored tactic, trapping entire towns and cities behind their walls for months at a time. Supplies dwindled quickly under such conditions, and disease spread rapidly in the cramped quarters. Starvation was common, and defenders often resorted to eating whatever they could find: rats, dogs, or even leather boiled into something barely edible. When the walls finally fell, the victors often showed no mercy. Looting, arson, and slaughter followed, erasing communities in hours. For peasants, there was no distinction between the banners of different armies. Both brought hardship and danger. The promises of kings meant little when survival depended on keeping one's head down, and surrendering whatever the soldiers demanded. Families learned to hide food in secret caches, to flee into forests or hills when the sound of marching feet approached. And yet, war was more than just violence. It was an economic machine, feeding itself on the resources and lives of those who could least afford to give them. Blacksmiths forged weapons day and night, farmers were conscripted to haul supplies, and entire industries rose to meet the demands of endless conflict. In some towns, war was not an interruption to normal life. It was the foundation of it. For those in power, the suffering of the common people was a distant concern. Victories were measured in captured castles, new lands, and the humiliation of rivals. The cost was counted not in the bodies of peasants, but in the gold spent to fund the next campaign. A noble might lament the destruction of a valuable estate, but rarely the lives lost in defending or retaking it. The war also deepened divisions between regions. Areas that lay far from the fighting might prosper briefly, taking advantage of trade disruptions elsewhere. But sooner or later, the shadow of conflict spread, whether through increased taxation, shortages of goods, or the arrival of refugees. Entire populations were displaced, fleeing from burned villages or besieged cities, seeking safety where there was little to be found. The psychological strain was immense. Children grew up knowing nothing but the presence of armed men and the uncertainty they brought. Generations were shaped by the constant need to prepare for flight, to rebuild from ruin, to mourn losses without the time or means to properly honor them. Trust between communities eroded as fear made people wary of strangers who might be spies or looters in disguise. And yet, in rare moments, even war could not completely erase the resilience of the human spirit. Villages rebuilt, fields were sown again, and trade resumed when the roads were clear. People clung to rituals and traditions, finding comfort in the familiar even as the world around them changed. But these brief respites never lasted long before the next wave of conflict crashed over them. The 100 Years' War and other prolonged conflicts of the age were not simply military struggles. They were grinding tests of endurance for entire populations. Unlike the plague, which struck swiftly and without warning, war was a slow erosion of stability. It drained the strength of nations year by year, generation by generation, until exhaustion became a way of life. By the time one battle ended, another would be brewing. Treaties and truces were written, but they were little more than pauses for the wounded to heal and the armies to replenish. The idea of a lasting peace felt as distant as the idea of a world without hunger or disease. For those living through it, the war was not a chapter in history. It was the story itself. In this way, war bound itself to the other miseries of the century. It worsened famine by destroying food supplies. It spread disease through the movement of armies and refugees. It deepened political instability, as rulers rose and fell with the fortunes of their campaigns. And it made every other hardship more difficult to bear. The century was not yet done with its cruelties, but already the toll was heavy. In the towns and villages that lay in the path of armies, in the cities that endured siege after siege, and in the hearts of those who had lost everything to the ambitions of distant kings, the sense of living in an unending nightmare was complete. War had no mercy, and in this time it had no end. Long before the plague and the wars reached their peaks, the land itself seemed to turn against the people. The Great Famine was not the work of a single season, but of years when the climate shifted, the skies darkened, and the soil refused to yield what was needed to sustain life. Hunger came first as an unwelcome guest, and then settled in as a permanent resident, reshaping the lives of all it touched. The causes were complex. Weather patterns began to change, bringing cold, wet summers and harsh winters. Crops that had once grown reliably rotted in the fields under relentless rains. Seeds failed to germinate in the waterlogged earth, and grain stores dwindled faster than they could be replenished. Even in regions spared the worst of the flooding, unexpected frosts could destroy months of labor in a single night. This period marked the beginning of what some now call the Little Ice Age, when average temperatures fell just enough to disrupt agricultural cycles. It was a subtle shift, but in a world without the technology to store food on a large scale or transport it over long distances, even small changes could be catastrophic. A few failed harvests might be weathered with hardship. Several in succession spelled disaster. In the first years of scarcity, communities tried to adapt. Families rationed their stores, eating smaller meals and stretching grain with whatever could be found: beans, roots, wild greens, or acorns. But as shortages deepened, desperation set in. Bread, once the staple of daily life, became a rare luxury. Poorer households might go weeks without tasting it, relying instead on thin pottages made from whatever scraps were available. The famine did not strike evenly. Wealthier nobles and merchants could still secure supplies through trade or by seizing them from their tenants. For the rural poor, however, there was no such recourse. When the harvest failed, they faced hunger directly, without buffer or protection. Many sold their possessions, land, or even their labor for years to come in exchange for enough food to survive another season. Malnutrition spread quickly, and with it came disease. Weak bodies were easy prey for illnesses that might otherwise have been endured. Children suffered the most. Many did not survive their early years, and those who did often grew up stunted and frail. The elderly, too, were among the first to perish, as families prioritized feeding the young and strong who might work the fields when the weather improved. Some turned to measures they might once have thought unthinkable. In towns and villages, there were whispered reports of theft from graves, as the recently buried were exhumed for the clothes they had been laid to rest in. Others scavenged in midden heaps, searching for rotting scraps. Along trade roads, travelers risked being set upon by starving bands, not for gold, but for whatever food they carried. In times of greatest desperation, stories emerged. Some exaggerated, others perhaps true, of families resorting to consuming whatever flesh they could find, even if it meant crossing the last taboo. Whether these accounts were rumor or reality, they reveal the depth of fear and misery that famine could bring. The hunger also became a weapon. Armies in wartime would burn fields and destroy mills not just to deny the enemy resources, but to starve entire regions into submission. In sieges, famine was often the deciding factor, reducing proud cities to surrender without the need for a final assault. Even outside of war, powerful lords sometimes hoarded grain to drive up prices, enriching themselves while their people starved. Markets, when they still operated, became centers of tension and resentment. A single sack of grain could cost more than a laborer earned in months. Those unable to pay went hungry, and riots sometimes broke out when word spread that a shipment of food was being diverted elsewhere. The thin line between order and chaos grew thinner with each passing season of poor yields. The famine's reach extended beyond the countryside. Cities, dependent on the surrounding farmlands for their food, found themselves unable to feed their growing populations. Urban poor, already living in cramped and unsanitary conditions, were hit hard. Bread lines grew longer, and beggars filled the streets. With so many competing for so little, even charitable institutions found themselves overwhelmed, forced to turn away the hungry at their gates. Religious interpretations of the famine abounded. Many saw it as divine punishment for sins, either personal or collective. Preachers warned that the scarcity was a sign of God's displeasure, urging repentance and humility. Others believed the changing climate and failing harvests were signs of an impending apocalypse. In both cases, the famine deepened a sense of helplessness. If the cause was divine will, then human effort to end it seemed futile. Yet not all responses were purely spiritual. Some communities attempted practical measures such as pooling resources, redistributing grain, or planting hardier crops. In certain regions, fishing and hunting became more important than ever, though these too could be limited by overuse and harsh weather. The ingenuity of survival was impressive, but it could not entirely overcome the scale of the crisis. The famine also reshaped demographics. Starvation claimed many lives, but so did migration. People abandoned their homes in search of food, swelling the ranks of refugees who moved from region to region, often meeting hostility and suspicion. The movement of hungry and weakened populations helped spread disease, compounding the disaster. Villages were left half empty, fields untended, and traditions interrupted as communities dissolved under the strain. Even when the weather began to shift and the harvests improved, recovery was slow. Fields needed to be cleared and replanted, herds rebuilt, and grain stores replenished. The physical and psychological damage lingered. Children who had grown up during the famine carried its marks in their bodies: shorter stature, chronic health problems, and reduced life expectancy. Those who had lost families and homes faced the future with a hard-learned understanding of scarcity.